our next speaker is Dr. Robert Verkerk, who is Scientific and Executive Director of the Alliance for Natural Healthcare International, and he's going to talk to us about shifting paradigms in research outcomes. Robert, the floor is yours.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I will be even happier when I see a picture of a fish appearing on the screen. So, AV people, thank you. Okay. So, yes, you've got to look hard to find these kinds of phenomena, and they can be captured. Bottom line is, my background is as a scientist, an ecologist, so I'm not talking as a homeopath. We're going to be looking for the next 40 minutes or so at the big picture of what's happening in research, what's happening in terms of logical constructs, how we can actually come up with a solution, and fundamentally, how we can spend a bit less time on the back foot and really get onto the front foot. So it was back in 2002, I established a non-profit called the Alliance for Natural Health International. This was after working for about 10 years with Imperial College London as an ecologist in sustainable agriculture, and I specifically had been offered a permanent position. And a permanent position in an environment in which the corporate pressures for funding were really starting to be felt. And I think one of the problems that we see in terms of the research we've looked at so far is opportunities for blue sky research are few and far between. So trying to really understand what life is, what the universe is, unless you have a commercial application, that's becoming tougher and tougher. So as an alliance, what we do is we work with a very wide range of people, scientists, academics, but we also work with lawyers, we work with the public, we work with a very broad section of practitioners across all modalities. And that's where we've developed this great friendship with people in the world of homeopathy. And I think there are two things that apply. Being a homeopath is probably one of the toughest healthcare modalities to be in, but working in the UK, where there's this jewel in the social welfare crown called the NHS that you will know has just had its 70th birthday, makes it even tougher because people are looking for free services, and there are a group of people that we call skeptics who are really not skeptics at all because they've got closed minds. A true skeptic has a very open mind. Who make life difficult for all of us. So these are some of the issues we're going to be looking at over the next half hour or so, looking at the difference between knowledge and belief. How do we believe? What do we believe? We've got to look at the principles of what happens in a healthcare situation and recognize that in the real world, we're often dealing with a situation that's very different from the one that we try and measure under very controlled conditions, for example, in a randomized clinical trial. We're going to look at some of the challenges in research, what kind of metrics we might want to measure, how do we validate them, and look at approaches for real-world assessment. So, this is a picture I took yesterday, and I made a big mistake, which was staying overnight in Chandos House, just as the demonstrators were there. And then when we tried to get to dinner, the demonstrators were outside the Houses of Parliament. So it was a challenge, but I figured there was a reason for it, which is why I show you this picture. And I'm not suggesting that I oppose any of the specific views of Donald Trump, but I'm also not suggesting that I support them. But I'm just asking you to think about if Donald Trump came out there and said he believes in homeopathy, would your view of him change? So we're dealing with this challenge between knowledge and beliefs. And I've recently had the experience of being invited by the BMJ and the reinsurance company Swiss Re to Switzerland. 200 of us were invited to look at what's happening in the field of nutritional research. Swiss Re are interested because they don't want people to die early, so they've got to pay out for lots of morbid people who live a long time. The BMJ are interested because they want to try and clean up some of the dastardly science that occurs in all fields of science, including nutrition. So they invited 200 of us to interrogate some of the leading epidemiologists and trial designers who have really created the current view on nutrition. And of course, in the audience were lots of people who supported the idea of a low-carb diet, and you're seeing the beginning of a transition change. And the reality, one of the conclusions at the end of 2 days of meetings is that beliefs are still stronger than the knowledge base. Because in science, what we have to accept is that we're often dealing with very fragmented knowledge. And so in that fragmented knowledge, we are trying to draw pictures that make sense to us. It's like joining the dots, as we did when we were children. And if we join different kinds of dots, we draw different kinds of pictures. And if our pictures don't agree with each other, we assume the other person is wrong. We see a different reality. So we need information to be relevant to us, and of course we need information in many forms. We have given up on religion. We've substituted science for religion largely as a global population. And of course we look for data, and we look for quantitative data generally. It has higher value. And of course, because most people don't understand quantitative data that well, it is subject to a lot of manipulation and statistical massage. There are people called healthcare communication experts that are basically PR agents who work behind, we used to call it ghostwriting. You're now not allowed to call it ghostwriting, they're just healthcare communications experts whose name now appears in the papers, and they get lots of kudos for being in PubMed. And of course, we also have other forms of data that we take into our minds, and we often discount this idea of feel and intuition and other information, whether something resonates. And I use that verb quite deliberately. We've got another part of the equation that we look to, which is the plausibility of this construct. And if it doesn't make sense to us, we can abandon the whole damn lot. And we're looking for this consistent logic structure all the time. We go to the big wide world, and we want to validate that as well, so that there's a consistency between the knowledge and the belief. And our own experiences, one of the reasons that people keep coming back to homeopathy, your patients keep coming back for more, is because it's benefited them. They don't really care that much about the mechanism. We care a lot about the mechanism if we're pure scientists. We also care about the mechanism because we believe it's going to preserve the modality. But the patient is looking at a positive experience of getting better or staying well. And it's interesting that in the medical sciences, it's one area of science in which we've let go of observation. So most of you will have heard of a character by the name of Edzard Ernst. And if you look... Yes, yeah, that's right. You look at an article that was an interview of him back in 2003 in the rather famous newspaper, The Guardian, basically said that his interest in medicine occurred when he was in a homeopathic hospital in Austria. And he was really drawn to it because of the profound effects that he saw. He later on was unable to confer or agree or understand the plausibility of the mechanisms. And I believe at some level, his ego possibly became more interested in actually getting support from people in mainstream medicine and also some very noisy skeptics. And he used that process to discount the whole system. So the knowledge, despite the fact that there was knowledge and observation and experience, the missing link was there. That logic structure no longer existed. So let's talk about Saddam Hussein. So you'll remember that between 1992 and 2003, George Bush was in power. Colin Powell basically in 2003 made these statements. They were very, very deliberately construed to create a logic pathway that the American people and the rest of the world would get behind. First of all, he's got the weapons. Secondly, those weapons are real and they present a danger. And thirdly, it would be a just war if you attack them preemptively. Okay? Now, Friedkin et al., Noah Friedkin and his team have developed a series of very complex algorithms looking specifically at this whole notion. And essentially what they're looking at is how a group can influence others in order to create consensus. And this is relevant, although we're talking about Saddam Hussein, because if we had more consensus in the field of homeopathy or in some fields of non-allopathic medicine, we would have fewer problems than we have. So a bunch of models that we're not going to look at, all published nicely in Science. And what you see is if those three statements are independent, we'll see that a group that is exposed to them settle down and take a range of different views. However, if there is more certainty placed on one of them, you're able to coalesce the views by creating a structured logical argument, as Colin Powell did, so that everyone can come together and decide that it's a great idea to go and attack Saddam Hussein. The same applies. They talk about intransigent skeptics that I assume most people in this room know nothing about. But what they did specifically is look at how that logical structure can be disrupted by the voices of a few. Does it sound a little bit familiar? And suddenly the plausibility of all three arguments dissipates altogether. You'll see on the y-axis the certainty of beliefs pretty much over time goes to zero. And that's the kind of effect that we're dealing with here. And of course, there's also a dynamic that can exist. If you get cross-pressure logic structure between statements 1 and 3, you've got a stockpile, and then it's just, you can actually separate out two of the arguments, enough to actually go to war. So I thought it might be interesting to look at some of the arguments that knock around with homeopathy. We see evidence of widespread usage of homeopathy, 60% in Germany, 50% in France, a mere 15% in the UK. But again, that number hasn't changed very much in 10 years because I think we've got to a group of true believers and almost nothing that will happen to those, nothing that is said in the public domain or by mainstream medics will change the view. And of course, what we have to accept is countries that have very widespread usage of homeopathy, we may see more of a cull there because there's a few fence sitters who will hear new arguments that don't actually conform with their logic structures. So, secondly, if you look at the totality of evidence that Peter Fisher has certainly discussed on many occasions, you'll see that there is pretty clear evidence of an effect beyond placebo, despite the fact we keep on hearing the fact that the mainstream view consider that there isn't. But there isn't necessarily consensus over possible mechanisms, again, as we've heard today. But all of it can fall apart again. Homeopathy cannot work as the proposed mechanism defies known laws of science. So perhaps we need to change the laws of science. And of course, that's precisely what we've been talking about for some of today. It's a very real possibility that just by playing with different elements of that process, that structure, we can change the entire system. Now, if we're believers, it's extraordinary what we do accept. We are perfectly comfortable. This is a bubble chart that basically shows that the bigger the bubble and the more it is moved to the top right of the screen there, the greater the risk of death to individuals and to society. And what you'll notice is that the top group, these are government figures. These are figures that governments have charge of, that they're familiar with, that they may not collate and interpret in the same way, but these are their data. It shows that preventable medical injuries in hospitals are the single greatest cause of death. Preventable medical injuries in hospitals. And in fact, they're in line with the risk of death if you are in the British military and you were serving at the time of the Afghanistan wars, Iraq-Afghanistan wars, apologies. And of course, the societal risk is low, but we're okay with that. It's still what goes on in the mainstream. What I should say is also somewhere in the middle we have food and bicycle accidents. I had a bad one about a week ago, but right in the left side, you'll see things like food supplements, herbal remedies, with a very, very low risk of death. And yet the regulatory system we see around them is getting closer and closer to the same as being for medicinal products themselves. We also know that views change quite slowly, and it depends on who's holding that view. So we grew up in a world where Pasteur's logical structures made a lot of sense to us, and we were fine about putting children on antibiotics and not talking to the parents about what the long-term implications of that might be. And it's really only in the last few years that we're beginning to really understand that there are a bunch of good guys doing an awful lot of work for us. We are more microbial than we are human. And even if we were to have a snack late at night, something that many people would regard to be innocuous, and we're allowed to feed our opioid receptors with something sweet late at night, what we do is we make life very, very tough for the super good guy in our guts, Akkermansia, that basically clears the mucosal lining overnight while we sleep so that our receptors can be open and responsive the next day to determine friend or foe. And it's now looking like the massive increase in autoimmune diseases probably have something to do with modern diet and lifestyles that interfere with the function of the gut microbiota and prevent the proper signaling between friend and foe. And so this is another area of emerging science. What about type 2 diabetes? Is it incurable, or is drug-free remission an option? And you can look at, say, back in 1995, we knew that there were a few drugs knocking around that were old, that were doing something. Low-carb diets is not a new-fangled idea. It was there in 1796. But of course, the authors conclude that it seems improbable that a single drug will be found to cure the many metabolic abnormalities. Polypharmacy, and they're not talking about homeopathic polypharmacy, seems inevitable for many patients. Yet, we move to the Lancet in 2018, and we start seeing through the direct trial evidence that actually non-drug-related remission of type 2 diabetes can be achieved using something that was used in 1796. So a resurgence in homeopathy is really quite possible. And it's not just medicine that this happens in. If you are a low-energy nuclear radiation specialist, you will be very aware of what has happened in the field of nuclear physics, and particularly around things like nuclear fusion that's always been seen as the holy grail. And you know, governments have put billions and billions of pounds, dollars, and euros and yen into the ITER project in southern France. And really, when you look at it, it is a scam. And yet the belief systems are such that there are still people in ITER saying, by 2045, we should have a working reactor. But they haven't even got energy balance yet. How on earth? There's not a plausible mechanism. They've had fusion working for fractions of a second. Some of these LENR researchers have got stable systems that are working, but of course they are shoved out of the limelight. They find it very, very difficult to get research. So it's a problem that we have across the fields. When the belief system is strong enough, we are prepared to accept no evidence of benefit. So as BMJ clinical evidence has shown, analysis of 3,000 different medical treatments, only 11% that are out there, all part of the NICE guidelines in the UK, only 11% are proven to be beneficial. Half of them, we really don't know very much about at all. We can't see any evidence of benefit, no evidence of harm. So there is an issue, and we once the model is accepted, we go along with it. So the question is, when you look at the totality of evidence in homeopathy, you have at least 5 systematic reviews and meta-analyses that are regarded as the pinnacle of the hierarchy of evidence. You've got one that I think everyone in this room understands was somewhat manipulated. Others may choose to have differing views, but all of a sudden, it's not enough. Homeopathy doesn't work, despite that we can observe evidence in front of us. What we should really be asking is, you know, how does it work? And will we accept it? And will we allow patients to continue to have choice, which is the big issue in the NHS right now, given that there is a body of evidence that shows a benefit. And in fact, that benefit may go beyond many conventional medicines. So what happens when you deliver a medical intervention? So obviously, what we have spent many years looking at in medical research is a specific therapeutic treatment. We're looking at whether that effect delivers some kind of effect measured as an outcome compared with a placebo. And there are a whole range of other factors. What is happening to the natural history of the disease? So if you say that you have done very well with one of your patients and they took a homeopathic remedy and they no longer have allergies, what would have happened without a control, which is one of the reasons RCTs are considered to have so much value. What about regression to the mean? What about this statistical phenomenon that the more times you take a measurement, the more likely it will equilibrate towards the middle of the bell-shaped curve? It's a very interesting phenomenon, and it is under-recognized in a lot of medical research. What about this extraordinary issue of gene and environment interactions? When I went through my training, I used to think there were about 100,000 genes. We now think there's probably only around about 20,000. But if you have a combination lot with just 4 letters on it, or you have a genetic code with 4 base pairs, it's amazing what you can do with it. And you look at the variation between each individuals, look at twin studies, and you'll see just how important the environment is, because it's the environment that controls the genetic expression, and it is the genetic expression that holds a very major bearing on our health. And of course, we also have to recognize that the gut microbiota which in itself contains probably in the order of 10 times. We are either 90% in terms of numbers or numbers of cells, or 99% in terms of the numbers of genes, microbial. So we're not really human at all. And if you look, this is, if anyone wants to look at the University of Luxembourg's virtual metabolic human, put it into Google, and you'll see how the culmination of research looking at metabolic pathways and different nutrients that are put into the body, how they play off and light up different parts of the metabolic system. So we've identified about 135 metabolic pathways, and of course we know from the Human Genome Project that our relationship with our environment is probably at its most intimate on the occasions that we feed. And so the kind of foods that we put in, whether or not they are contaminated, whether or not they're highly processed, what the macronutrient content is. There are a whole range of factors. And again, we are beginners in this science. So the science of nutrition itself is changing so rapidly because the food industry is changing so rapidly because of globalization. So factors changing all the time. We've also got to look at the Hawthorne effect. How does the behavior of an individual change when they are observed? And of course, this brings us to an effect that we discussed called the best practitioner effect, or why do you think you will have such variations between different practitioners who are administering the same protocol in a particular modality? And some of it is because of the differences in that patient-therapist interaction, the differences between those individuals, but also very often that practitioner is making other recommendations from a point of knowledge and a place where that practitioner is trusted. So this notion that we can actually turn medicine into a system that is devoid of that relationship, I think, is probably moving in the wrong direction, because we look to human interactions to be able to trust and believe and have support in a system. So the Hawthorne effect is profoundly important. Of course, we factor it out every time we do an RCT. There is almost certainly a major electromagnetic element of interaction between two humans. We look at studies on human auras. I think, you know, we've got to this genomic level of understanding medicine, and I think many of us are agreed that electromagnetic radiation is really the next frontier. And who's to say there's not going to be another 3, 5, 10, or even an infinite number of other frontiers? We are, at the best of times, flat earthers, and we've got to wake up and recognize that. And also, what other treatments are going on simultaneously? So even someone who's entirely dedicated to homeopathy probably has the odd paracetamol here and there, probably eats and may eat differently, has different ways of sleeping or addressing stress. So we are all involved in this very complex, multifactorial, multimodality environment. Of course, we've got a lot of psychosocial pressures on us. Some may be positive, some may be neutral, others may be negative. All of them influence the ability of the body to try and regain homeostasis. Real health and resilience is about having homeostasis, balance, and equilibrium across multiple systems, which is why so many of us are interested in whole body, ecosystem-based approaches in healthcare. So in our RCT, we look at two of those effects, try and look at the difference between placebo, and we neutralize everything else. And what we're suggesting is we need to move from RCTs to RWTs, which, if you didn't know, stands for real-world trial. We should also recognize that we only spend a little bit of time, probably a fraction of 1%, with a practitioner. And so when we do clinical studies, it's interesting that we talk about clinical studies. We don't talk about office studies or home studies or kitchen studies or walking in the forest studies. And yet we're experiencing all of these things that probably have extremely important influences on our health. And when we want to ramp up an effect, why do we downplay a whole range of effects that we know have profound influences on human health? So we've got to be looking at not just the time with the practitioner, also the time without it. So what are we going to look at in terms of measures and outcomes? Well, it might be we're looking at pain, or we're looking at symptoms of disease, which has been the mainstay of the disease management system that we see in allopathic medicine these days. We may look at improvements in symptoms. We may look at biomarkers, or we might look at a change in an energetic state or someone's vitality. We may also self-report. We also may have biomedical tests. But what about the how? The how is, it varies so much. What is the follow-up period? How accurate and reproducible are those measurements? How many measurements are you taking? What are your follow-up periods? What's the health status at baseline? What is your statistical power? Have you randomized and have you controlled? And if you haven't done the last two things, the data is perceived by the mainstream as junk, when we know it isn't. In reality, we're always dealing with a continuum between efficacy, which is an experimental measure in an artificial situation that's looking at the difference between specific therapeutic effect and placebo, through to effectiveness, which is what happens in the real world. And it is interesting that, for example, in the conference that I mentioned in Switzerland with BMJ and Swiss RE, the scientists there who have developed the primary views on nutrition are really exclusively looking only at randomized controlled trials and prospective cohort studies. They're ignoring any of these other trials. In a situation that we know the effects of which what we do in a less controlled environment can be profound, why are we not looking to really positive responders? Why aren't we looking to find outliers and then to understand more about what happens around those individuals? One of the interesting trends, and Microsoft, Google, Apple, and others are deeply engaged in this, is recognition that the individual needs to have much greater sovereignty over their health data. And of course, Google likes to share it, Apple likes to keep it for you. You can choose to share it with others, but of course, the data that's being collected is highly variable. We have different languages, different types of data around. It's very difficult for people to talk to each other or with a range of different healthcare professionals about it. One of the problems we see is we move more towards studies of effectiveness, we increase the uncontrolled variance or the noise in the system. So it's viewed as less reliable. There are more and more factors involved. The system becomes more messy, and as a result of that messiness, it becomes harder and harder to establish a causal relationship because we want to know how it works. The system is our scientific minds are obsessed about trying to understand how things work. But what is really important is that as we move towards effectiveness, we also have a stronger capacity to be able to demonstrate the effectiveness of these multifactorial systems. So our suggestion is let's go out there and study them. You're probably familiar with John Ioannidis from Stanford, who in 2005 in PLOS ONE published the famous study saying that most science is false. There's some pretty good reasons for it. And of course, it was interesting to see him coming in to the Swiss Re meeting and basically rubbish all of those RCTs and prospective cohort studies, much to the delight of all the 200 of us in the audience who knew that basically they're on the wrong track. The interesting thing at that point, it was only 2 days after the world's most significant study on the Mediterranean diet, PREDIMED, had just had to be withdrawn by the New England Journal of Medicine because they didn't randomize properly. And as you know, analysis of variance falls apart if you don't do your randomization. So you can go to lots of websites and get these lovely tag clouds, but I can assure you, you can't find one on this, so we built one ourselves. These are the areas, and I can see from the time available, I don't have time to talk to you about each and every one of those. But what you will see is within the picture research that we're so reliant on is a huge range of factors, all of which can be distorted and manipulated, particularly by vested interests, to give you a view on a subject that doesn't necessarily reflect the research. And that is really profound across many, many areas of healthcare. That is why we accept dangerous systems of healthcare. That's why we reject ones that appear safe and appear to be doing people good. And so we created a cartoon for you that basically shows what happens between warring factions of scientists. And we quite deliberately put the men out there at the front because they're the ones with the loudest mouths doing most of the shouting. And we do need to listen to female scientists more. And this notion of cherry-picking data or arguing about the hierarchy of evidence is an increasing problem if we don't start to have more of a universal language for how we actually manage what we sometimes think of as clinical experience. So we do need a universal language. We also need a universal context. These ones are off a picture library, by the way. We didn't create these. But we also need a universal context and a frame. And the context that we believe is most valid at the moment is basically an ecological context. And I say we because I'm an ecologist. Seriously, I think that the science of ecology pulls together this very notion of what life is and how life interacts with the biotic and abiotic environment. And that's an important starting point. And within a systems biology context, you're allowed to look at systems without looking at compartments or silos. It's the reductionistic approach that's associated with the huge developments of certain forms of scientific endeavor, including in medicine, that also creates a simultaneous problem if you're looking at biology and whole systems. So sometimes we need to stand back from the canvas and look at the bigger picture. And so we're very much looking at how systems biology, evolutionary biology can be applied to healthcare because we are an organism living in social communities within a biotic and abiotic life. And so this notion of working cooperatively and collaboratively, and I have to say to Ken, what a huge step forward I think this meeting is to bring so many disparate people together to try and get a more coherent view on the logic structures that we're all dealing with so that we can explain things better to people. And I want to finish off just very briefly by mentioning some work that we're doing in this field. We will be publishing in September a report that will also have a peer-reviewed paper supporting it that looks at how you could systematize a healthcare system from an ecological perspective. The notion of it is that it is open to everyone. There is no lockout. If you're a homeopath, you're not locked out. If you're a conventional doctor, you're not locked out. But it is like a level playing field that everyone can go in. Now, there is one difference. You're not in charge. The difference is that your patients are in charge. It's about returning power back to the individual so they can understand what is going on, that they can move to a system where we focus on upstream health care or health creation or health and resilience creation. The system at the moment, if we use the lens of sustainability, is not sustainable because we try and pick up the pieces once disease has manifested into 1,000 different forms, depending on that individual's genetic expression, where they've lived, how they've manifested. If we go upstream, what we typically find, what the research is really showing us, is that so many of the diseases, particularly the chronic degenerative diseases, the mental health diseases, and the autoimmune diseases, have origins that go back early in people's lives. So that would mean that if we did that, we moved to an upstream system. Healthcare doesn't just occur in clinics and hospitals. It occurs in homes, it occurs in workplaces, it occurs in forests and playgrounds, and especially kitchens. So there are many places where it can occur. And what we have been doing is building a kind of consensus view to the different systems that you can measure in different ways, that the individual can measure, that practitioners can measure, that scientists can measure, in order that they come up with consistent, common languages so that people can share information. So you can choose to go to one practitioner or another practitioner and deal with different segments of your system. The principle being that if all 12 systems are in balance, you have an environment in which disease cannot manifest. So for practitioners that are not medically trained, you don't have to worry about diagnosing disease. You worry more about normalizing functions within one of the subdomains of health, or 2 or 3 or 4. So it's a system that's potentially very empowering for individuals. What we've also done is look at hallmarks for sustainability. So the individual operates within their own individualized health system that interacts with their own environment, but also multiple health systems operate within a societal context in something we sometimes call a healthcare system that's really a disease management system. But what we've developed is a series of criteria, tick boxes if you like, that need to be fulfilled for the system to be sustainable. And we want to go off there and actually measure each one of these criteria and compare it with conventional systems and see if sustainability is increased. But there's, again, a lot of data that underpins each one of those. And you'll see what we've done here is look at the 12 systems of the biological terrain, and you'll see that they have 3 levels of evaluation: self-evaluation, guided self-evaluation, where a practitioner may be required. You collect the data, but a practitioner may need to help you to interpret those data. And then you have practitioner-only, more biomedical evaluation. You put it together to form a kind of matrix so that you can start to see transitions. So this is a 53-year-old female patient, and you'll see that on subdomain 1, her genetic and epigenetic background has not changed, but everything else over a 3-month period has changed. And what she's trying to do by engaging with different practitioners across different modalities is to see if she can push that radar chart, that spider chart, out to the outer part of it and clear up any kinks in it. So it's something that can also be demonstrated graphically. Ken had mentioned the work of David Balin and Balin's insurance in this. We've been collaborating for, I think, about 4 years. One of the systems we're developing here is an app to actually help support individuals to track their own health data that's entirely consistent with the blueprint for health system sustainability that I mentioned we're going to be publishing in September. And we've got a group of partners. We've got TNO in the Netherlands, who are really very much involved in the programming code side of the app. We've got Kansas University Medical Center. We've got 3 UK universities. So it is a collaboration. We have to understand this variation between the individual's health system and the national health system. And the national health system, of course, most people still think of it as this healthcare delivery system. When we have empowered individuals who are in control, in the driving seat of their own health, of course, they're the key players. The healthcare system just delivers goods and services that support that individual. So I want to just finish finally by, in fact, summarizing some of this co-creation for a new canvas on human health and resilience. I would say don't give up on science, but don't be a sheeple. So that means declaring your interest, being transparent, being open, doing all the things that BMJ is rightly asking us to do. We have to do a much better job at developing collaborative and participatory. And participatory involves your patients in research and organizing the total body of scientific knowledge for that specific issue. We have to fill gaps so that we can build a consistent logic structure. We've got to verify effectiveness so that we can start to get closer to some kind of a consensus over mechanisms. We've got to look at reproducibility. We've got to look at empirical and pragmatic studies and clinical experience and observation. Don't give up on that just because they're being shoved somewhere near the bottom of the hierarchy of evidence, so that we can validate knowledge and beliefs. And we need to do a lot more clinical, we call it clinical research, but it's really research that exists outside the clinic as well, focusing on total effect in multifactorial, complex, changing environments in exactly the way that we study rainforests or coral reefs or any other complex ecosystem. Understand the parameters, the factors, the drivers, the sensitivities within the system. And above all, we need to participate, cooperate, collaborate, co-create, and get onto the front foot. Thank you very much.